what I would do, just for example, for instance, if we sold 100,000 litres of milk, I'd just multiply that by, we'll say, cost of production. I'd take a figure like 35 cent a litre of a cost of production. And I'd say, well, that's equating to 35,000. And I'd stick that 35,000 into the trading account. And whatever was left in terms of the balance, so say I got a milk price of 50 cent a litre, that means there was 15,000 euros that I would just put into the deposit account straight away on the day I got the milk check. And I'd try and run the farm essentially out of the 35,000 and leave the 15,000 sitting on deposit.
Hello, I'm James Dunne, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights, and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Given the significant increase in input costs on dairy farms since 2021, along with an increased feed budget cost this spring due to poor weather, cash flow management has never been more important on dairy farms. I'm delighted to be joined by dairy farmer Sean O'Donnell, who outlines how he manages the financial aspects of his dairy business to ensure the correct decisions are made in an informed manner. So thanks for joining us, Sean.
Yeah, no problem, James. Yeah.
Maybe just to start, Sean, can you give us a bit of a background to your own farming business?
Yeah, sure. I suppose, we're up here in Ballina, County Mayo, the northwest, and I'm farming since about 2008. Took over from my dad there. He would have been milking about 40 cows at that stage. We had about 19 hectares on the milking platform when I took over, and we had another out farm as well, 13 hectares. So farming about 32 hectares in total. And I suppose the farm has grown a fair bit over the last number of years, and it's kind of been built on the principle of a cow's grass and cash mantra, and I suppose really it has stood us well over the last 10 or 15 years.
You mentioned that in terms of that development, and I suppose how has that, what are we saying, 2008, that's 15, 16 years ago now, Sean, how has that developed over time? Did a lot of that come post 2015, or was that kind of over that period?
No, it's kind of been steady all the way through, I suppose. It was kind of the tail end of 2008. I started coming home to go farming full time, and then 2009 was kind of my first full year. And I think if you look back to 2009, it was probably one of the worst years for milk production, or milk price, should I say. Like, I think milk price average that we got that year was about 22.5 cent a litre. So it was, we nearly went broke basically because it was such a poor milk price. And it probably cost us a lot more that year to produce milk because we had such an infertile herd as well. We ended up with a lot of cows empty as well. But over the years after that, we started, I suppose, growing the farm and started getting back on track, recovering from 2009. And I suppose 2010, we would have built a new parlour, probably went up to about 60 cows. 2011, probably built a calf shed, I think it was. And then in 2013, we had leased the farm actually in 2009, but in 2013 we bought that farm. It was 32 acres adjoining the milking platform here at home. And then we did other bits and pieces, cubicles and kind of bits of building work around the yard to try and get ourselves up to scratch. And we're milking at that stage, probably at the end of 2014, 2015, kind of milking about 100, 110 cows. And then at the end of 2016, we looked at leasing another farm. It was a 100-acre dairy and beef and sheep farm, organic beef and sheep farm, and we converted that to dairy in 2017 and put 100 cows on it. I suppose we had to do all the different works associated with that, put a parlour on it. It was basically a blank canvas, so we put a parlour on it, put rotors into it. We put a new bulk tank into it. Then we had to build cubicles at home because we hadn't enough cubicles. The plan was to winter all the cows at home and calve them at home. So we put 90 cubicles in at home and put down a solid tank in 2017. So that was a big investment at that stage and get going. And we got up to about 200 cows in 2017, 2018. I think again in 2018 we leased another farm as an outblock, 32 acres, and that farm was a fairly, I suppose, in poor shape, so we had to develop that farm as well, so there was a cost to that. And then in 2019 we built an underpass on the home farm because there's a regional road that's passing through kind of the middle of the farm. It's quite a busy road, so we built that underpass. And then in 2021 we put in additional slurry storage. We're getting tight for storage from a compliance point of view, so we put in a 250,000 gallon slurry store. And then in 22, we leased another 17 acres. In 23, we leased another 25 acres on top of that. And then this year, 2024, we've just after buying 40 acres of land. So today we stand at about 200 cows, maybe 120, 130 young stock, farming about 130 hectares, half of which is owned and half of which is leased. And half of the owned piece has been bought. So
before we move on to how you've managed financing that and cash flow through that period, but animal performance and maybe labour involved with running the farm at the moment?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of animal performance, we have a kind of a crossbred herd to be mainly LIC bred herd. Average live weight of the herd would be about 480 kilos. The last couple of years, we've averaged around 500 kilos of milk solids, fed about 700 to 800 kilos a meal, depending on the year. We're doing that we're just shy of 9% solids in terms of percentages, 8.97 last year. So we're quite an efficient herd of cows. 6-week calving rate for the last 6 or 7 years has been in the 90s. We're utilising about 14 ton or 13 ton of grass, growing over 14 tons. And I suppose big focus here, as I said, in terms of cash, in terms of the margin, delivering a good margin. In terms of labour, we have one full-time guy, Oisin McAndrew, who's working with us this is the second year with us on a full-time basis. And then we have 2 other people who come in and do milking for us, particularly on the other farms. So they kind of fill in the gaps when I'm not milking or Oisin is off. So it's kind of myself at one full-time person and 2 part-time people, I suppose.
Specifically in terms of managing cash, and where I heard you say there in terms of everything that you've done, and there's nearly a project there every year. Can you explain the process, I suppose, that you have from managing the business from a financial perspective?
I suppose, like anything, the financial piece in terms of getting good at it or getting better at it, it kind of evolved over the last number of years. It's not something that I was very good at, I suppose, starting out, and I probably made a good few mistakes, certainly in those earlier years, particularly around using a lot of, I suppose, cash flow to try and finance bigger projects, and that ended up leaving me in a position where I was tight for money, and so sometimes then when you have to go to the bank, you need to be able to paint a picture for the bank in terms of what you want to do. And to be able to do that, then you have to have, I suppose, decent financial management. So kind of the first thing that I started doing maybe back 6-7 years ago, and it was more or less around the time I started when we took on that second farm, because out of necessity, really, we had to get a little bit better at what we were doing in terms of financial management. I basically started doing on a monthly basis. When I was getting the milk check, I'd just take the number of litres that we sold for that month, and I'd multiply it by what I thought was a good figure for a cost of production. And I was totally guessing, really. There was no real science or fancy technology or figures behind it. It was just kind of guesstimates at the start. And what I would do, just for example, for instance, if we sold 100,000 litres of milk, I'd just multiply that by, I would say, cost of production. I'd take a figure like 35 cent a litre of a cost of production, and I'd say, well, that's equating to 35,000, and I stick that 35,000 into the trading account, and whatever was left in terms of the balance. So say I got a milk price of 50 cent a litre, and that means there was 15,000 euros that I would just put into the deposit account straight away on the day I got the milk check. And I'd try and run the farm essentially out of the 35,000 and leave the 15,000 sitting on deposit. And that was the first thing that I started doing in terms of, I suppose, getting started with sort of financial management, if you like. And that was a sort of a quick win, because it gave me a bit of confidence that I was actually able to run the farm on a lower cost than what I thought it was. So it was a really sort of psychological thing, nearly. It was like a behaviour issue that I had rather than a budgeting issue, because when you get this milk check, sometimes you're off you go and you think you've loads of money and you're off you go spending it. Whereas if you kind of restrict yourself and create a behaviour thing, I think it's a lot easier to control your financials.
As you say, that's a relatively straightforward in terms of 2 accounts, and it's probably it's discipline building, really. But how did that change your decision making maybe from that point on?
Well, it created a mindset, really, because when you were looking at the current account, there was less money in it, and so when there's less money there, you feel like you have less money to spend, basically. And it's the sort of, it creates a barrier between you, like that money that goes into the deposit account. There's a barrier there. There's sort of a bit of friction, if you like. where if you have to go and take that money back out of the deposit account, you're going to think about it. You're going to think twice about it. Simply because you want to try and leave as much there as you can for that day down the road when you're going to need it, or the following spring or whatever. So you think twice about it. The second thing I did, James, as well, and it didn't happen at the start either, it kind of happened as time wore on, is that I sort of structured my current account differently as time went on. So what I wanted to do was create a buffer, I suppose, between me and the daftness is what I call it. Like, basically, we used to get the milk check. Arrivo paid the milk check. I'm a Arrivo supplier. We paid the milk check on the 22nd of the month. And I basically, for the first 10 days after I got the milk check, would only pay my drawings, my wages for the people that were working for me. I'd pay my debt or leases, and I'd put a little bit of money aside for tax. And I wouldn't pay any other bills for the first 10 days. And I know that might seem odd or whatever, it might seem a little bit funny, but it just created a buffer. It gave me 10 days where it buffers you from the daftness, where sometimes you get this milk check and you have this new shiny thing in your mind that you want to buy, or this new thing you want to get for the farm. And sometimes when you get that milk check, off you go and you buy it, and you don't even think about it. And then 10 days later, you're going around with no money in your current account. And you're wondering, geez, what the hell am I going to do now to get myself to the next milk check? So it just gives you that buffer. And then I suppose from the first of the month, that following month, you're able to be more strategic about it, and you're able to be more planned, I suppose, in terms of paying the bills that you want to pay. You're able to go through the invoices. You're able to say, well, these are the bills I have to pay. And then you have a 3-week window until the next milk check to try and get those bills sorted. And you can do it, I suppose, in a more steady fashion rather than going out like a lot of us would have maybe in the past. You get the milk check, and next thing you pay all your bills, you pay all the people that you owe, and then 10 days later you have no money. Budgets are fine. You can do loads of budgets, and you can have budgets coming out your ears, but unless you're actually in control of what the money is doing, and you control your own behavior, then it doesn't really matter how many budgets you have, really. You have to be able to control yourself and your behavior, have a little bit of discipline around what you're doing. But you also need a few parameters to sort of set it up. And these are sort of personal to me and what I've done. I'm sure there'll be people listening that maybe will have other ideas and will do different things. And there are people who are doing lots of budgets and maybe getting on fine. But there's probably a lot of farmers out there who aren't doing any budgets, and maybe some simple techniques to actually just control their finances, to get them going, to get them started, would be important, I think.
How simple or complicated does that process need to be? What you've explained so far, Sean, is relatively simple and straightforward, and a lot of it is actually, as you say, in terms of creating discipline. How has that process changed or developed over the years for you, or have you made tweaks to that, or are you still running a similar process that you did in 2016, 2017?
Well, I still do the first two things that I spoke about there, because I've got a little bit better at it. There's not as much there's no guesstimates, I suppose. It's more, everything is sort of more strategic, and I have the numbers and I have the figures and I have the background now that I can do it. I built up a bank of knowledge, I suppose, from doing my own figures over the years. So you can do it a lot easier. But like the first thing I started doing in terms of actually building a cash flow budget and going back in time, aside from those two other things, was I just did 1 month at a time. And I started building it 1 month at a time. And I actually remember starting, it was around this time of year I started. And what I endeavored to do basically was to run the farm on less than I was making. And that sounds simple again, but it's actually quite difficult sometimes, because you have this backloading of bills, or you might have invoices coming out your ears, and you might be saying, geez, how am I going to do this? But it's basically just sitting down and rerunning your figures for the month. So you get your milk check or whatever it is, or your stock sales, and it's just sitting down for that 1 month. So for the month of May or the month of June, you just sit down and you say, these are the bills I have to pay. These are what has to go to the account. And how can I run this farm by doing that this month without going over the amount of money that I have coming in? And sometimes that can be very difficult. That can be very hard, because, you have a backlog of bills, and this spring has been very difficult. It's been an expensive spring. So to do that can be challenging. But that was the very first thing. And I started doing that just one month at a time. And then the next month I did it again. And then the next month I did it again. And that's the best way to build a budget, actually, is doing it bit by bit. I think sometimes when budgets are talked about and you talk to farmers and you say, well, you have to sit down now and do a 12-month forecast and predictions. It's very hard for farmers to do that, because it becomes a little bit overwhelming. And sometimes maybe you do have to do that. But at the same time, if you're starting out and you're only getting going, I think 1 month at a time is probably the easiest to get going. But I suppose a year like this, then it's probably more challenging to do that because you have to be able to pick forward. It's not going to be a high profit year or anything like that. But in terms of where I'm at today, I use a lot of historical data now to build budgets. I'm looking back on what I was doing last year. I have the information, and so I'm going to look back on what I was doing last year and maybe make predictions for this year. And there's tweaks and cuts and stuff that you can do. And I suppose the process now is still very simple. I run a ledger, a pen and paper. Basically, it's a ledger with a pen. I do an incoming and an outgoing page on each side of a book. I do that, and I work the budgets on that with a pen and paper before I would tap anything into a computer. I have a very simple spreadsheet. It's an oldish program that I use on the computer. It's nothing fancy, and it works. It spits out the information same as any fancy program would. And look, I try and keep it as simple as possible, really.
How does that process? How do you actually do that? Do you sit down one day a month? How does that happen on your farm? Is it all your own doing? Is there somebody else involved?
Well, it's primarily me that does it, I suppose, in terms of actually sitting down doing it. And my wife is definitely involved. She's involved in terms of the decision making and the bigger decisions, particularly. She's definitely be involved in that. But in terms of just sitting down to do it and tapping the figures in, that'd be me. In terms of like the process of it, I would sit down generally the day before the milk check and rerun a budget. So at this stage, it doesn't take that long. It's only taking me maybe an hour to do that. I'll go through the budget. I generally write it out. It's just the way my brain works. I'll write it out in pen and paper. I'll write down what I think is going to be coming in, what I need to spend for the month, what invoices are due, what are the definite payments like wages and drawings and tax and all those things. I'll write them down. And generally speaking, I'll have to do that 2 or 3 times in order to get the budget to work. So it'll be basically on a foolscap piece of paper. I'll have to rewrite it maybe 2 or 3 times, and some months to get it to work the way that I want it to work, in terms of that I say there's this amount of money coming in, there's this amount of money going out, and I need to have this amount of money left over. And it's nearly as simple as that.
How does that budget then impact on your decision making? So there's a project there that needs doing, and you've mentioned them down through the years. The budget says no, or that things are tight for the next couple of months. How are you using that in terms of to influence your decision making for those things?
Yeah, well, I suppose the budget will set the tone. Really, it sets the tone of what you can and cannot do, I suppose. And again, it's the behaviour then that delivers on that budget. And so if the budget says that this month I cannot do such and such a thing, just say I was buying a piece of machinery or whatever it is, say a piece of machinery breaks, which can happen on a farm, and it's no good anymore and you want to replace it. So you have to go out and replace that piece of machinery. So you have a couple of choices. You either say, no, I'm not buying that piece of machinery, just not doing it, I'm getting a contractor in instead. Or you say, well, look, I'll have to delay this. I'll have to find an alternative option for that bit of kit on the farm, and I'll have to delay it until I can accumulate the money to put it together and go and buy it then. Or else you have to finance it. Again, you have to build that into your cash flow. And then sometimes it's just a definite no. It's just like, no, I'm not going buying this. That's it. So there's those principles. So what I would do then, if it's a case where I have to delay it, then I have to rework the budgets. You'd have to rework the cash flow budgets. And generally speaking, in that case, something else is going to have to come out. That's in 90% of the cases, something else would have to come out if you're going to do that, or something comes up. If the budget is saying to me that I'm going to be in a big minus, coming towards the end of the year, well, then that's a real red light flashing. Like, I mean, it definitely wouldn't go spending anything that you shouldn't be spending.
Out of cash flow.
Out of cash flow, you just wouldn't. If I would have a policy on the farm, generally speaking, I try not to finance anything in terms of like machinery or anything like that. If I'm going to buy machinery or we'll say what I call consumer spending on the farm, kind of wants rather than needs, I would generally try not to finance those. I would try and build a reserve of money, and it just basically again creates a discipline around the fact that you're not kind of having this instant gratification around buying something. You're just sort of waiting, making sure you have the money, and if it's the right decision for the farm, then you'll take that money out of your account and you'll go and spend it on that, whatever it might be. But I try not to finance it if I can.
Explain that word, what fits into consumer spending in Sean O'Donnell's
Well,
vocab.
I could insult a pile of people now, so I'd be afraid to really say. But look, we don't do a lot of the bells and whistles. I'll put it like that. We're very simple, very basic. How we run the farm, I suppose, we're still tail painting cows. Things like that. We don't. If it's a shed, I try and finance it out of cash flow. This stage, traditionally, I would have probably borrowed for that. When it comes to borrowing money anymore, the only thing we're really willing to borrow money for is for land. We wouldn't be really interested in cash flow or borrowing money going down the road of financing anything else.
That has obviously changed over time, Sean, has it? Like obviously in those early years,
yeah, it has.
There was capex that the cash flow probably wouldn't have been there in terms of to do those projects and the needed doing.
That's it, yeah. That's 100% it. Like, I mean, we have over the years borrowed money, like we borrowed money to build parlours, we borrowed money to put up slurry storage, and we've done all that and paid them back and tried to pay them back quickly. We've always run a thing called a debt snowball. Basically, if we have a small loan, or say you have 2 or 3 loans on the farm, so we'll just rank the loan, smallest loan to highest loan, and we'll always try and put extra money into that smallest loan and get it paid off. And once we get that one paid off, we take that money and put it into the second loan, additional payments, that is. We've always tried to do that, and some years you'll do that really well, and other years you won't have any money to do it. So those kind of principles. But I suppose we're at a stage now where the farm is fairly well developed. We don't have a huge demand for cash in terms of building sheds or that kind of stuff. There will be small bits and pieces, and that'll be done, as I said, will be done out of cash flow. But as I said, for the long term of the business, in terms of building our profile, we want to try and buy some more land over the next number of years, and we don't really want to get ourselves tied up in I suppose that consumer debt, I suppose, for want of a better expression.
I'm down here in terms of mid-year review of 2024 performance. Difficult spring, obviously, and that followed on from what was quite a difficult back end in 2023. You're halfway through the year. How is performance maybe looking first and foremost?
Yeah, it's not too bad. In terms of milk output, in terms of litres, that is now, we're down about 3.3% on last year. Milk solids, kilos of milk solids were down about 1.5%. So our percentage solids are up slightly, mainly on the fat side. Protein is probably something similar to where it was last year. Milk price is up about 3 cents a litre. Some of that is milk solids adjusted, but most of it is base price. Base price has come up. It's not going to be a vintage year, like it's not going to be a very high profit year. So we kind of have to cut our costs to meet that. Our meal bill is down, even though it was a very tough spring. We're down about 20%. We've fed 20% less so far on last year.
How have you done that? Most people are obviously up on the 2023 figure. I think people want to know how have you reduced meal feeding levels?
It's based on the budget. So we did a budget at the start of the year. So I wasn't happy at the end of last year. Last year we fed 780 kilos of meal, and I wanted to reduce it. So I set a target at the start of the year that we weren't going to feed any more than 700 kilos of meal, and that meant for February, March, and April that we weren't going to feed above 3 kilos per day. And that's what we did. Even in the worst of the weather, we had some reasonably good silage in the yard, milk and cow silage. Probably not enough in hindsight what the year it was, but at the same time, we just stuck to it. We stuck to the budget, and through thick and thin, good weather, bad weather, mainly bad weather, and we just stuck to that budget, and that was it. And look, it was in the pudding maybe, and it's been maybe the eye-opening piece for me is that the cows have still milked, they've still done reasonable production, and it's probably saved our bacon a little bit in terms of that we haven't spent as much money.
I was just going to actually say that I think you said they're 1.5% back in terms of milk solids, and actually holding or reducing meal throughout the spring period is a massive feat given the spring we've had. But obviously that's based on getting cows to grass as many days as you can, Sean, even in difficult conditions.
Yeah, well, I suppose we're lucky enough. We don't have the driest of farm, but we have very good infrastructure built up on the farm. I suppose the home farm, we calve all the cows on the home farm, and then when the cows, we have a certain percentage of our cows calve, they go to the other farm. The other farm basically has no facilities on it other than a parlour and a stand-off area. And on that farm, we just feed grass and meal and some baleage. So I suppose when the cows were out grazing full time, and which they would have been from the end of February, you don't tend to feed as much meal when they're out grazing full time. So when they're inside on silage, maybe full time, that's when the meal starts to go in. So look, it all helps. But look, as I said, this year wasn't easy. It was difficult. There's no point saying otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, in terms of, you mentioned their meal feeding's actually back. So how are the costs tracking this year compared to last year?
Yeah, so I suppose fertilizer is down. If you look at the kind of the big headline costs, which are kind of feed and fertilizer, the two main ones. Fertilizer is down. We've spread year to date something similar to last year. Last year overall, we spent about 150 kilos of nitrogen across the whole farm. So we'll be on track to do something similar to that this year. But the overall cost of it is down simply because the cost per unit is less. So that's a big help. We wouldn't budget in terms of fertilizer. We have to grow the grass, so we have to grow the feed. But we wouldn't really budget to I suppose put out less fertilizer than maybe the 150 kilos of nitrogen. But it's not a high level of nitrogen, anyways, in my view. Other costs for us, like veterinary costs this year, were good. We're down slightly again on last year. We had quite a good spring from that regard. Like in 2023, we had a good few cases of milk fever on the farm. And this year we had no milk fever cases, which is probably the first year ever that we've had no milk fever cases. So it was a big help. And we had no veterinary call-outs, which again was a big help. So most of the veterinary costs this year were kind of built on the back of kind of preventative care, rather than sort of firefighting issues that you would have during the spring calving season. I suppose the other thing that we changed this year as well, with the land purchase, we bought that land, 40 acres, so we were contract rearing, and it was a significant cost. I know you can look at the cost of buying land; it's not cheap either, but they probably cancel one another out. But that's a cash flow cost that we've sort of probably reduced as well in the business.
33% increase, Sean, obviously in costs roughly across the board from 21 to 2022. What have you done? Because it's very easy to say, reduce costs. It's harder then on the ground. The reality is some of these input costs, they have went up, but is there anything specifically you've looked at over that period to say, right, we're moving into a higher cost period? To a degree, some of that is not our doing, obviously, but what specifics have you looked at over that period to keep a handle on costs?
Well, I suppose the key bit is, over a course of time, the first thing we tried to do before we even looked at costs was to get the gross output up. And I suppose we've done that maybe on the back of producing a higher value milk solid, I suppose, if you like. So we've done that to try and get the gross output up. If you can get that up, then you're basically, I won't say guaranteeing margin, but you're sort of building in a little bit extra margin into your system. So that has been a big driver over the last 7-8 years, to have a cow that's going to produce a higher value milk solid. So then on the cost side, like 21, 22 in particular, like the spike in input costs was massive. And like every farmer knows this, that, trying to deal with those rising costs was very, very difficult. So that was kind of set us on the road, maybe, of trying to use, let's say, for instance, if you use fertilizer as an example, trying to use less fertilizer, trying to find out what was the minimum amount you get away with without it affecting performance. And similar to that with meal. And that's kind of what we've done. Like we even do that down to dairy detergents, like in the parlour. Like we try and get away. We keep cutting back on an input to try and get it back to the point where it's not affecting performance. And at the point where it starts to affect performance, we maybe pull back a little bit and come back with it. So that's something we have done consistently over the years. But look, there's no silver bullet in cost. Like cost control is it's 1,000 different things. Like you nearly have to be, you have to be making 2 or 3 phone calls on inputs. You have to be. It's a constant battle really to try and keep costs down. But it's the last 2 or 3 years have been difficult. This year is the first year in those 2 or 3 years that you can sort of breathe a little bit easier on the cost side. But yet at the same time, on farms, my farm and many of the farms that I would see in my discussion groups, etc., there's been a lot of costs kind of built in over the last 2 or 3 years that are going to be fairly hard to pull out of the system.
Seems to be the same things that we talk about all the time, Sean.
It is, like, I mean, sure, it's the same. It is the same things that matter. You see, like it's that cow's grass and cash mantra, as I said at the very start. I mean, if you get your grass right, you can feed your cow right, and if you get your cow fed right cheaply, then you know it means you have more margin. But
maybe the last point, advice for our farmer listeners, for those people that want to maybe start managing cash better, what advice would you give to them?
Well, look, there's probably loads of people out there that are doing loads of cash flow budgets and getting on very well with it. So for the guys that aren't doing it, I would go back to those kind of 3 points that I made about when the milk check comes in, having that bit of discipline and the behavior piece. Like, I think that's so important. I think if you can get your behavior right and your discipline right, more so than the budget right, because every budget, like, no matter, something will pop up and will arise, during the course of the year that maybe you haven't budgeted for. But if you can get your general principle around your discipline and your behavior and create a little bit of a buffer between you and your outgoings, I think that's a really good starting place, because it creates that discipline without you actually even knowing it. And start 1 month at a time. Like, even this month is a great month to start. You'll be getting your May check now in June. We'll check in. It's a great month to start, and it's a month to start by basically saying to yourself, I'm going to run the farm on less than I take in this month. And if you can do that and create that margin by simply doing that thing, it offers you an opportunity down the line, because you're going to put that money aside that you're not using to run the farm. And it's going to be there for spring, and it's going to be there for that tight moment when cash flow is really tight, or when that next opportunity comes up, or that something presents itself that you weren't expecting. So those are the kind of things that I would say. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You don't have to go out and subscribe to some fancy accountancy package.
Pen and paper, as you said.
Pen and paper will get you started, no doubt. And I don't think you need to go spending a pile of money on a fancy package. You just need to get started with a simple pen and paper, list your incomings, list your outgoings, and see what the difference is. And that's the very start of a budget.
Look, at excellent insight in terms of how you're managing your farm, and how that has developed, I suppose, over the last 8 to 10 years. The big one that stuck out for me is in terms of it's discipline, and obviously the other one in terms of, as you say, cow, grass, cash. If we get those things right, they allow things to happen at farm level. So look at folks, that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Sean O'Donnell for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.